All right, so wanted to start my next series of videos talking about a subject that may seem a little unrelated to the previous subject, talking about my regret of voting for Trump, but I think it's actually very closely related, not just to the subject of Trump, but more broadly into kind of where we find modern American society and a lot of the frustrations and problems that everyone seems to have with it, right? Including myself. Um, I've become, pretty disillusioned with a lot of aspects of where the world is right now, especially our country. And one topic that is a major passion of mine, it's been my entire career, is around agriculture and farming. And I know, again, it might seem like it's unrelated, but agriculture, farming, the production of food really is the fundamental building block and foundation of civilization, right? And that goes back throughout all of human history. So my kind of theory and idea is that if we can change a foundational pillar like agriculture and farming for the better, that would have downstream impacts on other aspects of society in a beneficial way and push the world into a more just and equitable and fair place that many of us want to see, where power, wealth, influence is more vastly distributed across the population and not centralized in the hands of a few people as it is now and as it seems to be heading even more. So that's going to be my subject today is for this series of videos is the topic of regenerative agriculture, which is kind of a new movement within the agricultural industry. I say it's new. For those of you who aren't familiar with agriculture and farming, it's not something that you're very aware of. It may sound new. For those of you who are in that industry, it has been around for a while. So, first I want to kind of talk about my past, my career, why I'm passionate about agriculture, and then we'll get into the topic of what exactly is regenerative agriculture, right? And the reasons why I believe it could have a positive impact on society in the future if we were to steer food production in this direction, um, and see the downstream impacts of it throughout the entire food system and into greater society. So, as I mentioned in my previous videos, I was born and raised in Indiana, in the Midwest. Uh, I've been involved in agriculture and farming for my entire life, not necessarily as a farmer myself, which I know might sound confusing, but my family has been involved in what's called retail agriculture. So that's basically the companies that sell inputs to farmers, right? So um, the fertilizer, seed, chemicals, pesticides, um, doing services for them, such as application and things like that. Also dealing with technology, which is where I kind of fit in. That was a newer part of the industry that's came around in the last 15 years when my career began, is agricultural technology and using modern GPS systems and GIS information software, data analytics, things like that to help analyze the huge amount of data that gets generated by modern day machinery, tractors, planters, sprayers, combines, etc. All have a ton of different sensors that generate a bunch of different types of data. And basically my career has been taking that data and analyzing it in a spatial, way for farmers, like on an actual map showing you across a given 100-acre field, where are the better performing parts, where are the worst performing parts, and how can we uh, kind of calculate and redistribute your inputs to use them more effectively across the variability of that farm rather than just putting a flat rate of a certain product on there and treating it all the same, because it's not the same, right? There's differences across any amount of land when it comes to agricultural production. So, as I mentioned, you know, like I uh, I grew up in that kind of paradigm, um, and I have a little bit of experience farming, and I'll get into that later. Actually, that's actually something I'm very passionate about and kind of in the midst of starting right now. Um, but for the most part, as a child, I was in this small community, farming community. We had lambs that we showed for 4-H. So I don't know if many of you are familiar with 4-H and what that is, but it's basically like a kind of government-run program through the land grant university system. So like in my state, Indiana, Purdue is the land grant university. The Land Grant Act is something that Lincoln signed, um, 150 years ago, to basically expand the research of engineering and agriculture with one university per state. And that land grant university runs 4-H, which is a program for youth to, in the summer, do projects around different aspects of kind of rural life. One of those is raising animals. So we raised sheep my entire youth. That was our like kind of foray into farming, but it wasn't a commercial operation, right? This was a hobby farm. My parents still had full-time jobs, which, as I mentioned, were in the retail agriculture field, which is also where myself, my brother have worked our entire careers as well. So that's kind of my background when it comes to agriculture. It's something to me that I've always been passionate about because I just fundamentally believe producing food for others is a moral and ethical pursuit in life. Obviously, there's ways that we can do it better and ways we can do it worse, and that's a topic I'm very much going to get into in this video, in this series. But writ large, the whole pursuit of producing food for others, I think, is fundamentally good and something that we should strive to do our best in. So that's a bit of my background in terms of like where my passion for agriculture comes from, how I was raised. And as I mentioned in my career, I've been out of college for about 15 years now, and my entire career has been in conventional agriculture. So large scale monocrop, row cropping agriculture, corn and soybeans, large scale commodity farming. As I said, not as a farmer myself, but in the retail agricultural industry, specifically in ag technology, helping to analyze data and use modern technology and tools to help growers perform better. But during the last 4 or 5 years, I kind of had a change of heart, and this coincided with, I moved out of the Midwest, moved out west, started working for a cannabis company, which, for obvious reasons, has a way of kind of opening your mind out of the conservative paradigm you're born into. So that's what's kind of started my journey of change, right? Was moving out of my home state and moving into still agriculture technically, right? We're still growing a plant, but it was cannabis. So obviously not as conservative folks that work in that. So I got exposed to different ways of thinking and, a plant that I'm a big fan of for helping people become more open-minded and kind and compassionate, I would argue as well. And so it was during that time, a few years ago, that I really started exploring and taking a critical look at conventional agriculture and some of the problems I saw with it, right? So some of those problems are things like the massive use of pesticides, right? We use millions of tons of pesticides across the US every year. And even before we even get into the inputs, really, let's just talk about the crops, right? So in the United States, every year, we grow an area the size of Texas plus Kansas together, those two states combined in area, in just 3 plants: corn, soy, and wheat, right? And that is just from that, regardless of how you actually grow them, just that practice alone of having a monoculture of 3 plants across that land size is so completely unnatural and out of tune with how Mother Nature works and operates, that alone is a huge problem, right? Then you get into, okay, how do you make a monoculture like that survive because of the fact that it is so unnatural? There's only a few ways to do it, and that is you have to pump it full of synthetic fertilizers every year, protect it with pesticides, breed those plants into GMOs so that way you can spray glyphosate on them and not kill the corn or the wheat or the soybeans, but only kill the weeds, right? That's the whole idea and reason behind those herbicide and GMO products. And then also tillage, right? So massive amounts of tillage and soil disturbance that is very, very bad for breaking down topsoil and really impacting the way that soil operates in a highly negative way. So that was kind of, the paradigm of agriculture that I worked in for most of my career was operating within that conventional monocrop large-scale paradigm with a lot of crop protection products and pesticides and synthetic fertilizers and tillage, things that when you add them up over decades of time have a massively negative impact on the environment and on human health and ecological health downstream of that as well. So as I mentioned, my change of heart kind of came when I really started looking down a rabbit hole called regenerative agriculture. So regenerative agriculture is kind of the opposite idea of conventional agriculture, right? So rather than trying to domesticate and dominate Mother Nature to our own ends and using external inputs and synthetic inputs to achieve yields and grow food, regenerative agriculture really seeks to work within the bounds of ecology and within the natural cycles of Mother Nature to produce food in a bountiful and healthy way in concert with how the environment actually works and functions, right? So that's kind of the fundamental idea behind regenerative agriculture. And it seeks to really decrease the amount of synthetic fertilizers and crop protection products, pesticides, and genetically modified seeds that we use, and also tillage as well. So that's when that gets left out a lot, but tillage is incredibly destructive because of the fact that you're leaving the ground bare for a large amount of time, which is not natural, right? Like Mother Nature wants the soil to be covered with some kind of living, growing plant, fungi, organism on it. So that's really, when people talk about regenerative agriculture, it's one of the most confusing terms. It's one of those things that gets greenwashed, is what we kind of call it in the industry, where just like with anything, corporations co-opt the term for their own marketing usages and don't live up to it at all. But just like with anything like that, we have to distinguish the baby from the bathwater, right? And throw out the bathwater but keep the baby. So that mindset applies to so many topics in the world, right? And that's kind of another big insight I've had recently about a lot of different things. So regenerative agriculture, especially like in the modern day right now with the MAHA movement and RFK, there's a lot of misinformation around it and what it is and what it's not, and it gets misrepresented and gets used for for seeking of profit and things like that. Just like a lot of movements like this have happened to them. But really, when you understand the fundamental principles and apply them in a genuine way, it really is the best path forward for growing food and changing our food system from the ground up, and in a healthier way, not only for animals and plants and ecology, but also for human health as well. And my argument would be that regenerative agriculture, if you take it fully down the rabbit hole of analysis and critical thinking, you start to realize that it is like a fundamental critique of American society in every way. So it's a critique of capitalism, it's a critique of materialism and consumerism and the things that we value in this country that probably shouldn't be valued as much. And regenerative agriculture is really, when you think about it, a critique of that whole paradigm of thinking that, we should be extractive, that we should maximize profit over all else, that we should seek our own narcissistic self-interest in things that we do, and the consequences be damned, right? So that's a very unfortunate reality of where we are in a lot of ways in this country. And going back to my last series of videos, I think Trump is a massive red flag symptom of that, of where we are. Um, a lot of people in the comments were very, understandably frustrated, but like Trump is far from the first person to be the problem in politics and to be a liar. And obviously he is much worse. There's no doubt about that. But, if you think that everything was just going hummingly and great and ethically and just before that, I mean, you're kind of asleep, right? So Trump was the wake-up call that a lot of people needed, including myself, as to just how fundamental of change we need in this country. And I believe regenerative agriculture could be a major part of that, because of the fact that farming and the production of food is so fundamental to civilization itself, that if you can change that for the better, you would see downstream impacts of that in all different aspects of society. And one of the things that is fundamental to regenerative agriculture is soil health, really. Like, that's the thing that's really built on more than anything, is the protection of soil and the building of soil health year over year as we operate. And that's the major distinguishing factor between regenerative agriculture and conventional agriculture, is that conventional agriculture, we can see it, we can measure it, we can look at it just with our eyes and see the degradation of soil health over time the more years you operate in a conventional paradigm. Whereas you have the exact opposite when you function in a real regenerative agricultural paradigm, applying the principles in the right way. You build soil health year after year after year that you operate. And in the same way that changing food production has a massive impact downstream on human society, changing how the soil functions for the better has a massive impact on all the organisms downstream that live off the soil, from the fungi, the microbes, to the plants, to the animals, and everything that exists on that land exists in a healthier way. You can reverse climate change, you can sequester carbon, you can correct the water cycle. So when you're in drought prone areas, because you collect more carbon, you build more humus, you can hold more water, and then the water cycle comes back with getting more rain, right? And obviously all those things happen only on a large scale over a lot of time. But we have to start somewhere, and we have to make the change to begin. So that's what I'm really passionate about. I'm by no means like an expert on regenerative ag, and the purpose of this video is not to go through the technical ideas of regenerative ag, right? There's already some great YouTubers and farmers that I follow and that are out there that you can watch if you're interested in like learning how to do regenerative farming. That's not what I'm going to be talking about, but more about the idea of how can this help us in the overall battle for making a better world and country that is more equitable and just and fair, and that achieves the goal of decentralizing power and decentralizing wealth to the most amount of people possible. I think that's what we have to do, because the other option on the road right now is, as I mentioned, just straight up techno-fascism, techno-feudalism, where we all live under the rule of a given trillionaire in their city-state, right? And I don't think anyone should want that. No matter how good the AI girlfriends and drugs are they give you to cope with that, like the Brave New World, 1984 kind of paradigm, right? We want to move away from that. And I think regenerative agriculture could help rebuild small societies, rebuild small communities in a more decentralized fashion, so they're more self-reliant and interdependent and have mutually beneficial relationships with each other. And that's exactly what it seeks to do with the organisms living in the farming paradigm when you apply it regenerative agriculture is you're making more beneficial relationships between the fungi, the plants, the microbes, of animals that live together on a given piece of land, to make them work in harmony and still be able to support human life from that pursuit. So the three specific topics I'm going to talk about within this video will be ethics, ecology, and economy. And those are really, to me, when I think about applying regenerative agriculture to society and to the agricultural industry, those are the kind of the most important fundamental changes I see it having. And I would also mention, I specifically put them in that order for a reason, because I think that's the most important order of those three ideas. I think ethics comes before ecology, and ecology comes before economy. Economy is the least important of the three. I'm very intentional in putting that last. Some people might disagree with me on the order of the first two, ethics and ecology. This probably depends a little bit on your worldview and maybe your religious perspectives and things like that. But I believe that really, this is maybe a topic for another video, but just the reasons why I order ethics over ecology is that, I think subjective consciousness comes first, before matter, before reality. And so acting ethically instantiates a better world. And so you instantiate and create better ecology by acting in a genuinely ethical way towards Mother Nature, towards yourself, towards others, and not being extractive, not being selfish, not being narcissistic, not being self-interested, not pursuing profit, but by pursuing what's good and true and right, you will create a good world ecologically, not only for nature, but for humans, which are part of nature and part of ecology. I know people like to think of those as separate, and they're not. We're absolutely part of the world and part of the earth in every way. So that's why I specifically order them that way. I think ethics is the most important, then ecology, then economy last. And those are the three major impacts and reasons why I think implementing regenerative agriculture and spreading it as far and wide as possible to replace conventional agriculture and transition from conventional to regenerative, I think those are the three major impacts it would have that would then spread downstream to so many different aspects of society in a positive way. And that's what really excites me about it. And obviously it's something that would take years and decades of many, many hundreds and thousands of committed people applying that and spreading it. And I hope to be one of those people. That's really kind of how I see it. One other point I like to touch on here to kind of really drive this home, especially for those who are more scientific minded and maybe less kind of religious minded, is the discussion of evolution, right? So when we were all born or when we were all taught evolution, like one of the words you always hear is survival of the fittest, right? And it kind of implies that nature's all about competition only. And that's simply not true. And even Darwin wrote about that himself in his books, that nature is just as much a representation and a result of the mutual inner workings and mutual dependence and mutually beneficial relationships between organisms and between species and kingdoms, as much as it is a result of competition between them, right? And it makes sense when you look at the cultural paradigm of that time when those ideas came out in the Victorian era. That was the time of the peak of the British Empire, the peak of colonization. And so when you're Charles Darwin and you're a white guy from Britain espousing these ideas, the society you exist within is obviously going to take those ideas, and just like I talked about before, they are going to put bath water around the baby, and that bath water is just focusing on competition and saying, because that's a great way to say, like, hey, that's why we have the moral right to civilize these savages, because that's natural selection. That's just how Mother Nature works, right? We have a superior society. We can defeat them. So let competition reign, and to heck with cooperation, to heck with mutually beneficial relationships. Let's just dominate and control because that's how nature is. And so it makes total sense when you look at it why that part of the conversation is what came out of evolution, but that's not the whole picture. And Darwin himself talked about that if you go back and read Origin of Species and his papers from back then. And even more modern scientists have taken that idea and built on it over time. Something I'm certainly not an expert in, but I was very interested when I first found that out and did some research about it. And I think it speaks perfectly to the utility in the idea of regenerative agriculture, replacing the idea of extraction and domination of Earth and working with her in cooperation, facilitating and stewarding the mutual beneficial relationships between organisms to create a food system that is more interdependent and beneficial to those at the bottom, and produces higher quality food, better ecology, and is more ethical for the animals and plants and fungi that exist within the farming paradigm. So that's kind of my intro into my background about farming and agriculture, where I came from, my career in conventional ag, my transition into this new regenerative ag idea, what is regenerative ag, and the three main things, three main ideas of why I want to implement regenerative ag and how I think it'll impact society in a beneficial way as we pursue this fundamental change that we dearly need in America right now to pull us away from going down the fork in the road of techno-feudalism and instead pull us in the direction of more decentralized government, more power, influence, and wealth in the hands of everyday people to have control and decisions over their own life, and work together with their community to achieve something great. So that's kind of my intro. And then the next topic will be specifically going into the idea of ethics and why I think ethics is a major reason to support regenerative agriculture.